Would you stand for the reading of the gospel? I'll be reading from Luke, beginning in chapter 15 with the first verse. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. Which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? Then when he finds it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the sheep that was lost." Just so, I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Or what woman, having 10 silver coins, if she loses one of them, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? When she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost." Just so, I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Okay, with the exception of Ethan, I think y'all probably all remember. Well, maybe, I don't know. Tori, do you remember green stamps? Nope, Tori doesn't remember green stamps, so I got to tell y'all what green stamps were. Okay, most of you all remember green stamps. Green stamps were this thing that you would get when you went to the grocery store. You'd go to the grocery store, you'd buy your groceries, and based on how much money you spent, you got green stamps. It was stamps that went into these books. And you'd have different size stamps. Some size stamps, it only took one stamp to consider a page filled. Others, it was like 4 of them to consider a page filled. And others, you had to put these little ones all over the whole page to fill it up. And it was the job in most households, I'm guessing, because it was in ours, that children were the ones who put the stamps in the books. Now, what was the point of that, right? Well, because there were green stamp stores. And you would collect and save your green stamps and go to the green stamp store, and you could get all kinds of different things with your green stamps. They even had catalogs so you could know what you were saving up your green stamps for. I mean, you could even get something like a toaster at a green stamp store. People saved their green stamps. Nobody threw away their green stamps. They were valuable. And there was a time when we not only saved our green stamps, we saved our pennies. A penny was valuable. And we saved our pennies. And we didn't buy things before we had the money to buy them. Now, some people may not remember those days, but I can remember that. I can remember when I first had my first job, and one of the things that I wanted was this little camera. And I remember saving the money until I had all the money that I needed to buy the camera that I wanted. In fact, now, men, maybe you shouldn't listen to this, but women can't do it anymore anyway because we don't really work out of checkbooks the way we used to. My mother had taught me how she hid money in her checkbook in order to save money, because if my father picked up the checkbook, it looked like there was a lot less money in it, and he didn't think there was any money to spend. And she told me this when I was really young so that if anything ever happened to her, I could show my dad that they really had some money and where it was and how much there really was. So when I first got out on my own, that's what I did. That's how I saved money, is I hid it from myself in my checkbook. Once it had been moved to the back, you didn't get to spend it except for something you had saved it up for. And we used to repair things, didn't we? You remember Mayberry with Andy Griffith, and what was his name? Emmett Smith was the fix-it guy. And he was the one you took everything to repair. And we had things that were built to last, and if they broke, we took them in to be repaired. My mother has the same toaster that she got when she got married. I'm on my third or fourth toaster. But now the things that we buy have built-in obsolescence. It's cheaper to go buy something new than it is to repair something old, right? So we throw it away and we buy something new. Even a vacuum cleaner. Even a vacuum cleaner. When I was a kid, my mother would have just died at the thought of throwing out a vacuum cleaner and not having it repaired. So that's the world we live in. We have moved in a relatively short time from being a people who save our pennies, save our green stamps, save to buy what we want. We moved from that to people who did layaway. You remember layaway? You found what you wanted, you put it in layaway, and you paid for it, and when it was paid for, you got what you had paid for. You got it out of layaway. To a revolving credit where nobody waits for anything. And we also don't seem to value much. Because we didn't have to wait for anything, we've lost, since we don't have to wait, we don't have to save, things have lost their value. And sometimes it seems like people have even lost their value. Things will get so big, so rushed, so we don't live in a community anymore. We live in a whole world. What happens just in my community isn't what affects me. What happens in the next state affects me. What happens halfway around the world affects me, and I see it on the evening news. And as everything has gotten bigger and bigger, our values, the things that we value, have become less and less. And Jesus asked them, "Who among you, if one of your sheep got lost, wouldn't leave the 99 and go look for the one?" And today the answer is, who does that? Nobody would leave the 99 and go look for one. Who would do that? And so we live in a culture where, do you know one of the most common things for a pastor to hear from a congregation? And it's a sign when it starts to be said of people's disease. And that is, they say, "Preacher, don't forget the people who are here." You know, when you start looking at a church growing, you start looking towards the people who are outside the doors and not just focused internally. You start to hear, "Don't forget the people who are here. You can't lose anybody who's here. Remember who's here." And I think that's because the world we live in, we are afraid if we look too far outside, if we become too open, if we are too embracing of too many, that we won't be important anymore. That we will be forgotten. That we'll be the one who gets lost and nobody comes and looks for us. But I want to tell you something. I've told you before, as your pastor, I pray for people in this church, and I go through a rotation. And we're actually a small enough group, I get through everybody every week. So every one of you gets prayed for by me. Every week I think about you. And if you're having a hard time and you're on my longer prayer list, you're prayed for at least once every day. And if it's really bad, it's more than that. And sometimes when it's something that's really hard, you think you have long since gone off my prayer list, and you haven't. If you've lost somebody, if you lose a spouse, you're on my prayer list for a real long time, and it's longer than a year. If you've lost a child, you're on my prayer list forever. There are people who are still on my prayer list from 2 or 3 churches ago. So I'm not going to speak for every pastor, but I never forget you. Never. And when you're not here and I look out, I know if you're not here. I know where your seat is, and I know if I notice. And I might not call you that week because, one, sometimes things come up, and two, sometimes, we just need a little space, and I don't want to crowd you. But if it's not long enough, you're going to hear from me. Don't try. Don't test it. But you see, I think we're afraid that if we become too open, it's not just the pastor who's going to forget us. It's not just the person who sits next to us in the pews that's going to forget us. I wonder if we're afraid if God could forget us. And you see, the thing is, we use this parable and we'll say these parables and we'll say that God will go look for you. The thing is, God never lost you. To God, you are never, ever, ever lost. You came into being from the very breath of God. God knew you before you were born, and God never forgets you, and God never loses you. Wherever you go, even if you run and try to hide, God knows where you are. You may put your head in the sand where you can't see God. I've got a puppy, or he's not really a puppy anymore, but he thinks if he hides his eyes, we can't see him. And that's what we're like with God. We think if we hide and we don't look to God, that God doesn't see us either, and God always sees us as much as I see that sweet little puppy. You will never be lost. You will never be forgotten. Not one of you, ever. Every one of us is precious in the eyes of God. And so when we look to the outside, it's not because anyone forgets what's inside. It's because what we have overflows and is so tremendous. How could we not share it with someone who doesn't already have it? How could we not want to share what we have found here with someone else? When we really have the love of Christ inside of us, my cup runneth over, it overflows so much that we've got to give it away. And that, brothers and sisters, is good news. You're not lost. You're not forgotten. Ever. Let's stand and sing.